If your DNA story surprised you, imagine what we uncover next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Every documentary about this nation starts with the same sentence: direct descendants of the mound builders. An unbroken line from the Mississippian world to the present day. Every textbook repeats it. Every tribal history page opens with some version of it. But there is a document sitting in a federal archive that every one of those accounts quietly steps around. A single sheet of paper from 1866 that names people the bloodline story doesn't know what to do with. Nobody built a documentary around that sheet of paper. This one does. For most of the last 2 centuries, the story of the Muscogee people has been told as a story of continuity. Before European contact, their ancestors built ceremonial mounds across what is now Georgia and Alabama, complex centralized societies that anthropologists trace back through the Mississippian cultural tradition. The Muscogee Confederacy that Europeans encountered in the 18th century was already an alliance of dozens of towns, sharing ceremony and language, adapting to pressure from colonial powers on every side. Then came removal. In the 1830s, the federal government forced most of the Muscogee people west, along a corridor of death now remembered as the Trail of Tears. What survived that march became the modern Muscogee Nation, headquartered in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. This is the story taught in tribal curricula and in popular accounts alike, and it deserves to be told with respect. It is, in its broad strokes, true. Mound builders, Confederacy, removal, rebuilding. But somewhere in the middle of that clean narrative, there is a gap the story doesn't like to look at directly. Because the paperwork that eventually decided who counted as Muscogee, who got land, who got a vote, who got to say "I belong here," was not written by the mound builders' descendants. It was written by federal administrators, decades later, under a legal framework that had almost nothing to do with biology and everything to do with a treaty most people have never heard of. Here is where it gets complicated. In 1866, following the Civil War, during which the Muscogee Nation had split between Confederate and Union loyalties, the United States forced a new treaty on the tribe. Article 2 of that treaty is explicit. It states that people of African descent who had been enslaved by Muscogee citizens, along with their descendants, shall have and enjoy all the rights and privileges of native citizens, including an equal interest in the soil. Not a lesser citizenship, not a probationary one, equal. The treaty drew no distinction based on how much Muscogee ancestry a person carried. Citizenship was political, not genetic. For over 100 years, that was the law. The Muscogee Nation built 3 new towns specifically so these citizens, known as Creek Freedmen, would have representation in the National Council. Freedmen served in tribal government. Their names sit in the historical record beside every other Muscogee families. Then, in 1979, the nation rewrote its constitution and added a requirement that citizens prove descent from someone listed specifically as Creek by blood on the Dawes Rolls. The federal enrollment records compiled between 1898 and 1906 to divide up tribal land into individual allotments. Overnight, thousands of freedmen descendants, some with documented Creek ancestry going back generations, were excluded because Dawes-era enrollers, working under the racial logic of their time, had sorted people into rigid boxes. Creek by blood, freedmen, intermarried white. A person could look Muscogee, live Muscogee, speak the language, and still be filed under a category that the 1979 Constitution decided didn't count. The name was changed. The category was rewritten. The right was withdrawn. That's the 20th century legal history. Here is where the genetics stops being a footnote and becomes the anomaly. Population geneticists studying African American ancestry across the United States, most notably a 2014 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics by researchers including Katarzyna Brick, found that Native American genetic ancestry shows up broadly across African American populations nationwide, not just in tribal communities, and that this signal is strongest and oldest in the historic Southeast. A separate 2019 study in PLOS Genetics traced that Native American genetic component in African-descended Americans back to a specific source. Early admixture in the antebellum South, later carried outward across the country during the 20th century Great Migration. A haplogroup, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is something like a genetic surname, a marker passed down the maternal or paternal line, not on paper, but written directly into the body. And what these studies are describing is a surname that quietly persisted in populations the 1979 rule was designed to write out of the family tree entirely. Here is the first theory, and it's the most straightforward one. The admixture is exactly what you'd expect from 2 centuries of shared geography. Native, European, and African-descended populations lived, worked, and in many cases were forced into intimate proximity across the pre-removal Southeast. Through intermarriage, through slavery, through the blending forced by simple physical closeness. Gene flow follows contact. That is basic population genetics, and researchers are careful to frame it as exactly that. An expected outcome, not an anomaly requiring some exotic explanation. But this theory, solid as it is, doesn't explain something else. Why a citizenship system built in 1979 treated ancestry as a clean, sortable binary, when the biology underneath had never been binary at all. The second theory is more complicated, and it points the finger somewhere else entirely, at the Dawes Commission itself. Between 1898 and 1906, federal enrollers moving through Indian territory made rapid, often visual judgments about who counted as Indian by blood and who didn't. Historians and tribal members have long argued the roles were inconsistent, shaped as much by an enroller's snap impression of skin color or physical appearance as by any actual genealogical review. This is the part the records don't explain well. A person with a documented Creek grandparent could be filed as freedman simply because a clerk, working through hundreds of names a day under the one-drop logic common in that era, decided African ancestry took precedence over indigenous ancestry on the page. That means the paper trail itself may have been scrambling ancestry, independent of what was actually true biologically. This theory explains the distortion baked into the record. It does not fully explain why, generations later, a genetic signal researchers weren't even looking for in this specific population shows up so persistently in the modern DNA data anyway. And here the story stops being simple. There's a third possibility, and most researchers are hesitant to say it in quite this blunt a way. But the data doesn't confirm it's wrong either. It's this. Muscogee may never have referred to one single coherent biological population at all. The Muscogee Confederacy was a political alliance. Dozens of towns, some linguistically distinct, some with different histories of contact and absorption, including groups like the Yuchi and the Alabama, and the Coushatta, folded together under a single colonial-era label, for the convenience of outsiders trying to name what they saw. The data doesn't confirm this, it only fails to rule it out. Tribal identity has always been a cultural and political fact as much as a biological one, but the underlying population structure researchers can measure has never resolved into one tidy signature. That tension, between a nation as a political fact and a nation as a genetic fact, is not something anyone has closed. Imagine standing in the citizenship office in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, on a July afternoon so humid the air feels solid. The building smells like old paper and toner cartridges. A woman in her 60s sits across a folding table from a clerk, holding two documents. In one hand, a laminated tribal card with a blood quantum fraction printed in small type near the bottom. In the other, a folded printout from a commercial DNA test, showing a pie chart of ancestry percentages that doesn't map cleanly onto anything the card requires. Neither document, on its own, answers the question she actually came in with. Who am I, according to the people who get to decide? She has a great-great-grandmother listed on the Dawes Rolls, under Freedmen, not by blood. This is the part the 20th century didn't plan for. The very ancestry that federal administrators tried to minimize, sort out, or erase from the by blood category, turned out to be historically load-bearing for the nation's survival. Creek freedmen fought, farmed, held office, and rebuilt alongside every other Muscogee family after removal. Their labor and their citizenship were part of what let the nation function as a self-governing body through some of its hardest decades. Not by years, by generations. The idea of an ancient, unchanged bloodline, pure, continuous, untouched, was never actually how Muscogee survival worked. Alliance worked, adoption worked, mixture worked. Purity is a 20th century legal fiction, laid over a much messier and, frankly, more resilient history. In July 2025, the Muscogee Nation Supreme Court itself formally acknowledged part of this, ruling that the by-blood requirement, written into the 1979 Constitution, was void from the moment it was adopted, and ordering the nation's Citizenship Board to begin enrolling freedmen descendants once again. One of the lead attorneys in that case, himself a descendant of Creek freedmen, said simply that his community had always carried the truth of who they were, and that the ruling was, finally, the truth being recognized rather than granted. Rebuilt after removal. Adapted. Rebuilt after allotment. Adapted. Rebuilt after 1979. Adapted. That pattern isn't unique to one nation, and it isn't only about blood quantum law. Nearly every group that has ever had to legally define who belongs, a tribe, a nation-state, an ethnic category on a census form, is negotiating between politics and biology, not reporting a clean genetic fact. The moment any government freezes ancestry into law, it freezes it at a level of scientific understanding that keeps moving without it. The question this raises isn't really about the Muscogee Nation alone. It's about what happens whenever the story a people tell about their own bloodline gets written into law before anyone actually finishes asking what the bloodline is. A roll is not a genome, a treaty is not a haplotype, and a nation is not the paper it was once filed under. It's closer to a river that's been dammed and rerouted and dammed again, still carrying, underneath every new channel, the same water it started with. What Muscogee Creek DNA actually shows is not the textbook story, and it was never going to resolve into one. The record keeps being reopened. The question of who counts, and on whose terms, is still being argued, not settled, and maybe not meant to be.